going to continue our discussion of vernacular architectural styles in the Ozarks, specifically talking about farm buildings and barns mainly. Before we do, though, we're going to look at our famous Ozarker of the day. I know somebody's going to get this one because somebody answered this fella on your introductory quiz we did. Who knows? Okay. Millie knows Emmett Kelly. Yeah. Most of you don't remember Emmett Kelly, but
I'm old.
you remember when Emmett Kelly was well known. How many of you have seen a picture of that guy before? That particular clown. You've probably seen it. My aunt has a collection of like Emmett Kelly figurines or something. I mean, they're little porcelain sort of things. I'm not sure how old they are, but his stage name was Weary Willie, and he developed this kind of sad clown character that he did with Barnum and Bailey, and became one of the most famous clowns of the 20th century. And for several years, up until just a couple of years ago, the town of Houston, Missouri, which is the seat of Texas County, that should be easy enough to remember, Houston, Texas. Houston, Missouri had an international clown festival in his honor. I don't think they have that anymore. I think they quit having it a few years ago. And he lived in Houston, Missouri for part of his childhood. I think there are actually a couple places that claim him. There's a town in Kansas where I believe he may have gone to high school or something like that claims him, but Houston, Missouri claims him as well. And again, had you been born a generation or two earlier, you probably would have recognized Weary Willie, Emmett Kelly. All right, our word for the day. We finally have a single word. Duckins. Who knows what duckins means? No? No, really, this one has, the word duck really doesn't have any bearing on this one.
Is it clothing?
Yeah, how'd you come up with that? It's a specific kind of clothing. Yeah, Millie knows it's clothing, but it does refer to a specific kind of clothing. No? Pants? You're pulling that one out, aren't you? Yeah. It's duckins would be in the Ozarks. It would probably be usually overalls or maybe old jeans or something like that would be duckins. So we've got. So it's basically, you can see there are clothes for everyday wear, usually for men. So in this case, overalls or old tattered jeans or something kind of old, wore out that you wouldn't wear. You wouldn't normally wear to Sunday service, and if you did, people would talk about you, that kind of thing. So that's what duckins is. So you can you've got a new word to, yeah. This one got out of hand. I don't know what happened, but this was it's the soliloquy of kind of a nosy old woman. That's who's talking about Odell's duckins, but yeah.
What happened to the clown?
What's that mean?
It's does anybody know what that means? I'm gonna. No. If you tell somebody you're gonna tell somebody or show somebody how the cow ate the cabbages, basically you're gonna set them straight. Yeah. If you're saying it in sort of a violent way, you may even rough them up a little bit, that kind of thing. But it's basically setting somebody straight, telling them how it is, how the cow ate the cabbage. Yeah. So, yeah. And anybody recognize this one? To cut a dash? What do you do if you cut a dash?
You cut corners.
No, not cutting corners. It's actually if you're kind of showing out, doing something you shouldn't be doing. Usually you talk about kids cutting a dash. If a kid's showing out at church, or you take them to town, they're not acting right, they're cutting a dash. Yeah. Showing out. Yeah, in the Ozarks it's showing out. Yeah. Yeah. You didn't realize just how much you... That's why we have these vocabulary lessons, because some people just find it impossible to communicate with us. So, yeah. Okay. And face powder, of course, is what? Makeup. Yeah. Yeah, that's what a lot of old-timers refer to as makeup. We'll continue our discussion of architecture, and mainly in the 19th century Ozarks. We're still talking about sort of the early days of Ozarks settlement. And this is what we've got before we actually get into the different kinds of barns that were built in the Ozarks, the styles of barns. We've got some examples of different kinds of notching. Remember last time we talked about the different square notches and saddle notches and half dovetails and full dovetails and all that kind of stuff. This is an example of a square notched building right there. You can see that one's about to come apart. This is something that you saw in the Ozarks a lot too. This is an example of reuse of a building. Those logs there, which are really big, there's really nothing to kind of give you the scale of how big they are, but these are big logs that predate the Civil War. They came from a house that was built in the antebellum era in North Arkansas, and in the early 20th century, with the house kind of declining a little bit, getting a little decrepit, the people took the house apart and used the logs to build a barn with. And this is actually the inside of their barn, and they just put the logs back together in the barn. And so those used to be on a house at one time. But that's an example of some old pre-Civil War logs. One of the things you'll find about a barn is there's almost never any chinking in between the logs. In a barn, why bother with it? It's just extra work, and usually you don't need airtight, or don't necessarily have to have the cold out or anything like that. So I'm sure on the original house, these logs would have been chinked in the middle with some kind of lime-based mortar. But when they rebuilt this into a barn, they just left the logs open in between them. Here's a log house from the 1930s, the Depression era, that has saddle notching. And notice anything different about the outside of this one? About the outside of the logs? Yeah, they still got the bark on them, or it looks from that picture like they've got the bark on it. And in the 19th century, that would have been something that people almost never would have done. You always would have knocked the bark off and kind of squared the logs up. Usually you wouldn't even use round logs. You would square the sides of them. But this is a 1930s era log house. This was one that probably indicates that it was inspired by early 20th century log construction from other parts of the country, or it could be a reflection of poverty, of the poverty of the family, and just not knowing how you're supposed to really build log buildings. It could be that. But in the 20th century, it became more and more popular for people, especially like when people started building hunting cabins and and vacation cabins back in the woods. It was popular to leave the bark on because it looks more rustic that way. Doesn't look as refined as a nice slicked off log house does. And so it could just be that, you know. Now here's an old barn that has an example of half dovetail notching. You can kind of see where it slopes down there, but it's straight across there, so you get the half dovetail effect. And again, you can see where the axe marks have been left in the logs, and that's probably from the late 1800s. That old barn is. Again, no chinking in the middle of it or in between the logs. Okay, the types of barns, just as we had different types of log houses for construction, you got different types of barns. One thing to remember is when you're talking about a house, you have pens. When you're talking about a barn, you have cribs. It's basically the same. They're basically one room, but in a barn you call that one room a crib instead of a pen. And this is an example here of a single crib barn that has been mostly covered up with sheet metal. And you can see here where the logs are showing out. And that's just one crib. That's just a single crib barn. A lot of times the cribs were built to store corn in or some kind of grain, especially a crib like that that's built up off the ground. You probably weren't keeping animals in that. We've already mentioned in an earlier lesson that corn was the most common crop, and so every farm had at least one barn that was used as a corn crib. You can see here's a double crib barn, and that one has a breezeway or whatever you want to call it there in between the two cribs. This particular double crib barn obviously has a loft in it. They didn't always have to. You could just have two cribs sitting side by side, maybe connected, you know, or maybe exactly side by side. This one has a loft that they're putting hay up in. And you can see here a pretty laborious method of getting your hay up in the loft. Pitchforks, forking it up, you know, passing it from one person to the next until it gets in the loft. There's really no easy way to put hay in a loft, but you know, there are easier ways than that to put hay in a loft. What's that? Yeah, these are two women, and then there's a man up here in the loft. It depends on what your preference is, which one's the bad job. The loft is going to be the hottest job because you're up there, not much air floating around. This loft, they probably got wood shingles, wood roof on this one, so it wouldn't be quite as hot. When you start getting tin roofs on barns, you can imagine how hot those things get up in the loft. Not a lot of air circulating around. But yeah, that's going to be a pretty tough job. Yeah, both these women have got tough jobs. Yeah. The Ozarks was no place for dainty women. Yeah, there weren't many of them. Yeah, if you lived in the rural Ozarks, most women worked alongside their husbands in the fields. And most of them also, in addition to the field work they did, also did the usual housework, child rearing. Yeah, a baby every 18 months to 2 years. And so, you know, you kind of, once a few of them get a little bigger, they can help raise the kids.
Right there,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Once you get enough of them, then you don't have to do you don't have to help the husband and all. You just send the kids out.
That's right. And that was part of the reason the families were so large was they produced their own labor forces. On poor farms or even not so poor farms, it was not uncommon for families to have 10 kids or more. And you've got a lot of mouths to feed, but they can work and sort of pay for themselves once they get big enough. And big enough on a farm might mean 7 or 8 years old when you can actually start doing meaningful work that contributes to the family.
The women were pretty indispensable. I mean, they often died.
Oh, yeah.
All these babies. And
Sure.
the men would have to find another one pretty quick.
Right, yeah, and usually men didn't waste much time because they, if you had 8 or 9 kids,
Yeah.
it was high priority to go out and find another woman,
Yeah.
and you might go through 2 or 3 of them before you finally die. That was not uncommon, yeah. So we talked about the 2-story log house. Jacob Wolf, another part of his story was that he was married 3 times. His first 2 wives died. Both of them had several children. I think he ended up with like 16 kids, and had a lot of hands around the farm there. And Millie's right. It was not uncommon for women to die. A lot of times in childbirth, in the days before we had really advanced medical care, there was very little medical care of any kind in the rural Ozarks, or compared to today, pretty much anywhere back in the 1800s. Medicine was fire. Yeah. Lots of houses burnt because you're dealing with open flames in a house, and a lot of stuff to burn. But so that's a good double crib barn. Here's a 4-crib barn, and this one was at one time a really neat barn. You can see here this passageway is going to go all the way through through the other end. So in a sense it's a transverse barn. Anytime you have a barn that has a passageway that goes all the way through, that's a transverse barn. And this one at one time had a passageway that went the other way. So it had passageways going, and so you had 4 cribs that were only connected by this loft on top of it. So that was a pretty fancy barn at one time. But at some point somebody came along and boarded up or put sheet metal or something over one of the passageways that went through there. And you can still see a few barns like this in the rural Ozarks. The old ones, may not be used for much anymore, but that would have been a fancy barn at one time for sure. Here's another example of one with a passageway that goes through it. This is a double crib barn. This is an example too of a double crib barn where one crib is quite a bit older than the other crib. And you can tell even on that picture that the logs are different quality, the construction is a little bit different. And this one is no longer used. I actually took that picture a couple of years ago. And you can see that they put a roof on it, and they've got these poles to prop up the eaves and everything. This one has a loft in it as well, but this is the older side and the newer side right there. And you can see these logs are not very big, and they're still kind of rounded. They didn't really square them off very much. This is a picture. This one's actually not in the Ozarks, but at one time you probably would have seen a barn or two like this. This is a transverse barn. Again, really transverse just means a barn that has a passageway that goes through it. So several of the ones that we looked at you could kind of call a transverse barn, but this is a really big barn. I think this one's from the Smoky Mountains. Has anybody ever been to the Smoky Mountains National Park? I think that's where I got the picture of that barn, if I remember right. But it's got a really big, impressive log cribs in here. There's probably four of them, 2 on each side, and you can go right through there. Why would you have a big open passageway in the middle of a barn in the 1800s? What would be the purpose? Yeah, take a wagon through there. You could leave it under there, or you could unload stuff in it. Lots of people back in those days would have a stomping area underneath the barn where when they raised wheat, they would take the wheat, throw it out, let the horses stomp around on it to separate the wheat, the grain, and that was used back in those days. Sometimes the transverse areas were used for that. Or you could pull it in there if you had a loft and hoist stuff from the wagon into the loft. So there are a lot of different reasons for having an open area through the middle of your barn. Plus it looks kind of neat, you know. And when you get your Model T, you can drive the Model T in there. Now this is a neat one, and you see some of these in the Ozarks. Anywhere where you got a lot of steep ground, and there's a lot of steep ground in the Ozarks, every once in a while you'll see one of these bank barns, and it's just what it sounds like. It's a barn that's built into the side of a bank somewhere, and this particular picture was taken in Stone County, Arkansas, but you can find these all over the Ozarks. And some of these barns could be 3-story barns. You have, in this particular barn, you've got a bottom floor down here that you can only get to from this side. You can, from the ground floor up here, you can go into the second floor. And then there may even be a loft in there. You can't really tell from that picture. There's enough room to have a loft in that barn. So, just adapting to the terrain. So you can still see some of those bank barns around the Ozarks today. And this one looks like a pretty good rock foundation under it. And there's this morning when I was driving into work, I passed a bank barn, and it's not quite as tall as that one, but it's built on a little bank and still in use. Barns obviously weren't the only buildings needed around a farmstead. One of the other buildings that you would find on almost any farm in the Ozarks in the 1800s and into the early 1900s was the smokehouse. And here are a couple examples of smokehouses that have survived. They're no longer used as smokehouses. This one here I don't think is used as anything, or at least it wasn't when I took the picture. It had some bottles and stuff like that laying in the bottom of it. And this one here may be used as storage or something like that. I was trespassing, so I didn't want to really get in there. And, that's why the barbed wire fence is there between me and the smokehouse. But what was the smokehouse used for? For smoking meat. Yeah, you hang.
Aren't those kind of big, though? Weren't they usually smaller than that?
Those are probably pretty typical size. They're actually not very big. We don't have anything, to show the scale of them all that much. I don't even know how big they are, how big the dimensions are, but they're not really very big. Those are probably pretty typical size smokehouses. Sometimes there were really big smokehouses, and I was amazed. I was reading this is the woman from Taney County who was writing about her family building the dog trot house. And it's the same one whose family first built a stone house when they came to the Ozarks. But she's taught at the same time that or right after they built their 20 by 24 dog trot house, they built a smokehouse that was 24 by 30 feet. That's a huge smokehouse. That's like a warehouse instead of a smokehouse. But she said they not only stored meat in it, which is what a smokehouse was used for, but they also had a section where they stored vegetables in it. So it was kind of a smokehouse storage barn sort of area. But 24 by 30 feet, that's a lot bigger than these smokehouses. Because these are not very big at all. But in the days when most people killed their own meat, usually pork is what was hung in these smokehouses, and you literally smoke the meat. Build smoldering fires in there of hickory chips or whatever else you've got, and they smoke over a time. And then you just leave them in there. Pork preserves pretty well like that. You leave it in there and go cut some off whenever you get ready to eat it. Yeah. But neither one of these are in use today. They just still happen to be standing. And this one's in pretty good shape there. And that one probably dates from the late 1800s as well. Oh, they dry tobacco in it. Yeah, they grow their own tobacco and dry it in there. Yeah. Yeah. In some places in the Ozarks in the 19th century, you would have had tobacco sheds. There was a period after the Civil War when tobacco became a pretty popular crop in the Ozarks, but I don't know of any surviving actual tobacco sheds from that period that we know of. I mean, they could be, and they've been modified for some other use, but you still see a lot of old tobacco sheds back in North Carolina and Tennessee and Kentucky, places like that. But that's kind of neat that they're still doing that. Now, this is kind of a schematic, a drawing of what you might call a typical Ozarks farmstead. This one is a farmstead that dates from the early 1900s, but a lot of these buildings would have been used in the late 1800s as well. But you can see all the different buildings that are on here, and I don't even know what all they are because I can't read but you can see you've got a little lot that's fenced in there, and you're going to have a chicken house. You'll have stables somewhere. You'll have a smokehouse, probably an outhouse somewhere. The outhouse may be out of the picture. You don't want the outhouse next to the smokehouse, probably. You get that, and you want that somewhere downwind most of the time. Has anybody ever heard of a roost pole? You know what a roost pole is? I'd never heard of a roost pole until this weekend. I was reading an account where this woman was talking about her family not having an outhouse when she was a kid, and they had what they called a roost pole, which was basically a tree where they all went to use the bathroom out in the woods, and they called it the roost pole. If you think about where chickens or turkeys roost all the time, what's going to be, there's going to be mess all over that. It's basically it becomes their bathroom. Well, it's the same sort of concept, a human roost pole. But I don't think there's a roost pole anywhere on that. But I had never heard that term until this weekend.
Where would they I was thinking trash. Then I was thinking they wouldn't have a lot of trash, but if they would have
they'd have it. Yeah,
or whatever.
Yeah, by the 20th century, certainly you would have had some trash on a farm. There would have been bottles, some cans, old equipment that's worn out and stuff like that. What do you think they did with their trash? burned what would burn, buried it. But, you know, there are always ditches and stuff on farms. You know, erosion or you've got, you know, wet weather creeks and stuff like that, and you find places and you make your own trash piles. That's pretty much. The pigs and goats could eat what they could eat. Yeah.
I got a couple of places on my property that I have to clean out. They're old garbage piles.
Yeah. Yeah. That's here's one of the things that a lot of people don't realize about rural America is that there's a lot of trash out there. I know where I live in the rural Ozarks, up until really not much more than a decade or so ago, you had people who lived out in the country had to have their own landfills. You know, there was no rural trash pickup. You know, that's almost a 21st century phenomenon where I grew up. I know when I was a kid, we had a big washed out place at the edge of one of our hay fields, and that became our trash pile. And there's still a big bunch of trash in there. You know, you can get interested every once in a while and just go digging around and see. I remember that. I remember playing with that when I was a kid.
The women can too, and they used glass.
Yeah.
Used it and reused it.
Right. Yeah. There was a lot less trash on farms in those days, but you know they had to do something with it, and archaeologists are glad there was trash because that's how they find out what they know about, you know, historical archaeology. It's real valuable for the study of a place like the Ozarks. So many people in the Ozarks didn't leave written records. Many of them couldn't write or read, and even if they could, they didn't necessarily leave behind diaries and journals and records of what they did from day to day or big collections of letters from one family member to another. And much of what we know about the 19th century Ozarks and what people did and how they lived comes from historical archaeology, historical anthropologists who've dug around in these trash piles beneath old houses, house places in, I think they call it midden.
They call it midden pits.
Midden pits. And that's trash, you know, trash pile for the rest of us. And they're very, very valuable just to see what people had, what they used, what they threw out. You know, what kind of plates they had. Were they homemade or were they imported from England? And you know, so there's a lot you can learn about trash piles. Maybe you can turn yours into an organized dig. You know, just to see what you can find out. But that is actually a real place. I've been there before. I didn't do the drawing, but the woman who studied that place, you know, did the drawing as kind of a typical rural Ozarks farmstead from the early 20th century. And most of those buildings are still there. It's no longer an operating farm, but most of it's still there. This is a different topic, though related in some way, and I didn't have any other good place to throw this in, so we squeeze it in with our architecture. And if you've ever wondered, if you drive around not just the Ozarks but anywhere in small town America, you see lots of different styles of court squares or town squares. You know, they're not all the same. There are different patterns, different designs for those. And 4 of the primary different kinds of squares that you'll find are pictured up here. And they have different block square. This is usually referred to as the Shelbyville Square, the one up there on the left. That's the most common kind of town square in the Ozarks. It may not be everywhere in the United States, but here in the Ozarks, that's the most common type of design for towns. Probably. It's been too long since I've been to Bolivar on it. Well, now that you mention it, I have got somewhere my cheat sheet. Yeah, Bolivar's on the list for Shelbyville squares. Roughly half of the town squares that I've got on my list, the ones that I knew about, are Shelbyville squares. That's your typical, four corners with the courthouse or something in the middle. It doesn't necessarily have to be a county seat. There are other towns in the Ozarks that are built on the old town square model. I think, let's see, Winona. Have you been to Winona? I think it's the Shelbyville Square with like a little pavilion or something in the middle. It's not a county seat. It's just the Philadelphia or Lancaster Square. Springfield, Fredericktown, which is over in the eastern Ozarks, Stockton. If any of you have been to Stockton, Missouri, out northwest of here. West Plains is on that model. Doniphan, Missouri is on that model, where you have the streets lead directly in to the middle of the street, of the square. You're kind of head on with the courthouse when you get to the middle of that, instead of at the corners. Just different ways of designing these. That's the most common, the second most common, and the other two are very rare. According to my notes here, I've got there are at least 3 towns that are 4-block square, that are on this model, or some modified version of it. The closest one is Ozark. That's sort of on the 4-block model. I think it's on 4-block only on 2 sides. I think there's 2 sides of the square where you got that, and then the other sides I think are all, so it's kind of a modified. Marshfield. Who's from Marshfield? It's sort of the 4-block style.
Both sides have a street going through the middle.
Yeah, it's a real 4-block, isn't it? Not just a kind of modified. And Mount Vernon, over in Lawrence County. It's been too long since I've been there, so I don't remember exactly. And the only one I have on the list is a Harrisonburg Square. Ozark maybe more. No, Ozark's got the side streets too. But the Harrisonburg Square, I've got Jackson, Missouri, which is over close to Cape Girardeau. But again, it's been too long since I've been over there, and I don't really know. I'll take my word for it. I put together the list at some point. I thought I knew what I was doing, I guess. But that's just, again, we've talked mostly about farm life and farm people, rural life in the Ozarks and what they built and how they built it and all that kind of stuff. But obviously not everybody in the 19th century Ozarks, and certainly in the 20th century Ozarks, lived on farms. There were towns being built, and these towns, again, just like the architecture of barns and houses that was imported across the Mississippi River, brought from other places. We weren't inventing anything new over here. The same with these town squares. These all had antecedents back east, and the people who came from areas back east brought these town plats, these town designs with them. And that's why Shelbyville refers to Shelbyville, Tennessee. Very common. And of course, we've talked about the importance of Tennessee for the settlement of the Ozarks, the leading supplier of settlers in the 19th century Ozarks. And obviously Philadelphia and Lancaster, Harrisonburg, all towns back east or cities back east. And so that's a little bit about court squares, and I think there's one more thing on here. Yeah. This is West Plains. You can see it says Howell County Courthouse. And I'm not sure. Yeah, that's just an extension of what we've already been talking about. And again, West Plains, a little bit different with it's got the same kind of design that Springfield's old town square, downtown area has. And that's one of the differences. In West Plains, the courthouse is in the middle of that Lancaster square, unlike Springfield. All right, any questions about squares and such? Log barns, dirt daubers, or mud daubers?
Y'all talk funny here.
Well, you know, we probably think the same thing about Ewans. See, that's an Ozark term, Ewans instead of y'all. But yeah, Ewans. Not many people save that one either. We've sort of given in, and everybody's adopted y'all in the Ozarks. It used to be Ewans, Weans, Thesens. I don't know if it's Thesens, but yeah.
You didn't speak on it, kind of alluded to, but like outhouses and stuff like that, there wasn't no common form for latrines and outdoor.
Yeah.
uses,
Well,
or-
the thing about the 19th century Ozarks is outhouses were very uncommon. You know, that was more of a 20th century. There were outhouses in some places in the Ozarks in the 19th century, but your run-of-the-mill common rural Ozarker more than likely didn't have an outhouse back in those days. You know, it was more likely that you had a roost pole, or that, you know, you go out the back of the house, the women go one way and the men go the other way, you know, and you find the nearest thicket, you know, that sort of thing. So, you know, it's
That would be better than chamber pot, I would think.
chamber pot. Does anybody know what a chamber pot is?
Oh, yeah.
We have one in my house. We don't
You
use
do?
it, but my,
Oh, you?
my parents had one. It was one of their, I don't know whose it was, but we still got it.
Yeah, the old chamber pot.
Kept under the-
Yeah, there were other names for that too. One of the more colorful names that I've heard Ozarkers call it is the Thunder Mug. Has anybody ever heard that one? Well, yeah, that too. But yeah, the old chamber pot or the Thunder Mug. Yeah. And that was so. We seem to all know what that, a bedpan. You know, that's what they are in the hospital. But of course, those came in handy in wintertime, especially when you didn't want to step outside. But that's another thing too. You read memoirs or you read accounts of people who grew up in the rural Ozarks or the rural anywhere for that matter, and it was very common to just nearly freeze to death. You know, the quilts were so important to these pioneer families because if you had one fireplace, one chimney, if you're too far from that chimney, you're not getting a lot of the benefit from it. And these old houses, even if you've got them chinked up pretty good, they're still losing a lot of heat. And yeah, they're not airtight by any stretch of the imagination. And I've read accounts where people said they would just completely cover up with 5 or 6 quilts, just as much cover as they could get on them. And they'd wake up in the morning, you know, with frost on the quilts or on top of their head. What little bit was sticking out of the cover, you know, or a little dusting of snow that would blow in the cracks of the house and stuff like that. So, again, we're fortunate from a material standpoint to have all the things that we have, and to not have to face all those hardships that they faced. The good thing for them was they didn't know any better. You know, that's when time machines wouldn't be really useful. You know, if you got a week or two in the future and you get a little air conditioning, you know, get to ride around in a car, and all of a sudden you have to go back. You don't have access to any of that anymore. You know, but if you don't know any better, you know, we don't know what we're missing. You know, who knows what in 50 years, what kind of gadgets and doodads there will be to